Part 1.
Our guest today is Marvin Andrews, better known as the Orchid Doctor. Thanks for being on our show.
Thanks for inviting me.
I love orchids, but I think I don't have enough talent to grow them. I failed to make them have flowers. And they all withered and died. What makes them so delicate and fragile?
Well, first of all, you are one of the millions of people who love this flower. They have been around longer than human beings and are one of the oldest flowering plants. I like to think that they were the first flowers that humankind fell in love with.
If they've been around so long, I must be wrong in thinking they are so weak.
They aren't weak at all. Or rather, they make up for some of their weaknesses in very creative ways.
Can you give us some examples?
Sure. Some types of orchids do best in an environment where there is a high level of acid. They can obtain this in nature from ants. One particular orchid has a chamber like a guest room for ants to live in. When an enemy attacks the ant, it produces an acid in defense.
So, they benefit each other from the relationship, huh? Are there any other examples?
In other cases, however, the relationship is more one-sided. Some orchids need birds and insects to spread their pollen from flower to reproduce. So they attract their helpers in a number of ways. One is by smell. There are some orchids that smell like dead meat to attract flies, or smell like a female bee ready for reproduction. Another one is by their look. There is one orchid that looks very much like a butterfly in flight. The purpose of their various tricks is the same, to find a delivery service for their pollen.
Interesting. Well, we'll be back in a minute after the commercial break with some more fascinating stories about the orchids. Please stay tuned.
Part 2.
Listen to part of a lecture in an architecture class. Many tourists go to Italy to see a very interesting sight. It's an old, round tower that looks like it's falling over. Of course, I'm talking about the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It was built beginning way back in 1173.
When did it start to lean?
That's a good question. It took 5 years to finish the first 3 floors. And in that short time, the tower had already started leaning towards the north. After that, work stopped for 100 years. When a new team of builders took over in 1275, they tried to fix the lean. They built the next 3 floors parallel with the ground instead of with the leaning tower. That fixed the problem for a while. Pretty soon, though, the tower started leaning the other way, towards the south. The last 2 floors were finished in 1350, with the whole thing still leaning. Okay. In the 1900s, lots of people tried to fix the lean because, well, it was increasing a little bit each year. So eventually the tower was going to fall over. In 1934, many holes were made in the tower's base and filled with cement. This was supposed to make the foundation stronger, but it actually caused the tower to lean more. In 1995, workers tried to add earth under the south side to raise it. But during the project, the tower started leaning even more, so they stopped. Finally, in 1999, they tried the opposite idea, taking away earth under the north side to lower it. This worked out well, and the tower was made 16 inches straighter.
Professor, why didn't they just make it perfectly straight?
Well, they could have, but then all those tourists who go to see the Leaning Tower of Pisa would be pretty upset, wouldn't they?
Part 3.
Listen to part of a lecture in an oceanography class.
What is one main difference between seawater and fresh water? Seawater is salty, of course. Interestingly enough, though, not all seawater has the same salinity, the same salt content. Some parts of the ocean are saltier than others. I should start off by explaining that salinity is usually expressed in ppm, parts per million, and the average salinity of seawater is 35,000 ppm.
Parts per million. Could you explain what that means?
Sure. It's a way of measuring the amount of one substance in relation to another. In our case, that would be salt to water. It means that out of 1 million parts of water, 35,000 parts are salt. Another way to think of it is to divide 35,000 by 1 million and you get 3.5%. So seawater is 3.5% salt. Anyway, let's talk about the salinity of seawater again. As I was saying, it varies. So, what is it that causes the salinity of seawater to vary by region? Well, there are a lot of factors, like evaporation, precipitation, the addition of fresh water from rivers, and the melting of ice. These processes may either increase or decrease the salinity of seawater. Let's start by considering evaporation. It's the process that turns liquid water into a gas. And when that happens in the ocean, water gets removed, but all the salt stays behind. So the result is that evaporation increases the salinity of seawater. In general, tropical places that experience a lot of evaporation have oceans with high salinity. Now, precipitation is basically the opposite of evaporation. When it rains, more water gets added to the ocean, but the amount of salt stays the same. What this means is that precipitation decreases the salinity of seawater. Fresh water flowing to the ocean from rivers has the same effect as precipitation. It introduces water, but not salt, so it causes the salinity of seawater to decrease. Near the coast, seawater often has a lower salinity because of the flow of fresh water from rivers. Lastly, there's melting ice, which also introduces fresh water into the ocean. The result, again, is to lower the salinity of seawater. This is obviously more of a factor in polar oceans.
Part 4.
I'm writing a paper about how men and women have different styles of communicating.
Really? My girlfriend is always complaining that I don't listen, but I do listen, and when I'm talking, she always interrupts.
It sounds like you are a high considerateness speaker while your girlfriend is a high involvement speaker. See, it might seem to you like your girlfriend is interrupting, but really that's her way of getting involved in the conversation. And since she's like that, when you don't do the same thing, it seems to her like you're not listening. But really, you are just being considerate by letting her speak.
I never thought of it that way. There's one other thing. When my girlfriend has a problem and she tells me about it, she seems kind of offended when I give her advice. Why is that?
Okay, that's another barrier between men and women. See, we women are actually very good problem solvers in our own right. But some of us like to express our emotions about the situation that is causing us problems. So sometimes we're just voicing our concerns, but men think we're looking for a solution. So they think they are being helpful, naturally. But the thing is, when the obvious solution is pointed out to us, one we already knew, it makes us feel silly for bringing it up. It kind of feels like you think we're stupid or something.
I don't think she's stupid. I just want to help. Like last week, she was quite upset because she had waited all day for someone to come and install her cable. I offered to call the company for her.
But she's perfectly capable of calling herself.
I know, and she had. And the problem was solved, so why was she upset?
That's her way of getting close to you, by sharing her feelings with you.
Part 5.
How do we communicate our thoughts and ideas today? By telephone, fax, email. What did people do thousands of years ago before computers? How did they buy things from foreign lands? I'll tell you, they used the Silk Road. The Silk Road connected the Roman Empire with the imperial court of China. It became famous as a trade route, but when it first started in the 2nd century BC, it was for military and political purposes. A court official from the Han Dynasty in China was sent to the West on a mission to seek allies. The information he brought to China about the West and the information he told the West about China made people want things from each other's countries. For example, Chinese silk became very popular with the Romans. That's how the Silk Road got its name. By the mid-8th century, the Silk Road was very popular. The Tang dynasty in China was at peace and wanted its economy to develop. It therefore developed policies to encourage trade. Goods were sold and knowledge and ideas were shared. Then, from the 10th century until the 13th century, trade declined. There was more fighting and less stability, in part because of the frequent Mongol invasions. However, people in Europe still wanted Asian goods. Therefore, there was a search for a sea route to help meet this demand. Once a sea route was discovered, it was essentially the end of the Silk Road. It was cheaper, less dangerous, and more convenient to use boats. As you can see, even though the Silk Road has decreased in importance, for many years it was a vital means of trading goods, ideas, knowledge, and technology.